Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In Moscow, the war is a television backdrop. In Yakutia, Buryatia, Irkutsk, Tomsk, and Kamchatka, it is a funeral, a missing son, and a village with no young men left. Putin promised a special operation, but for the rest of the country, it looks a lot more like demographic amputation. On this episode, we'll show you how vastly different Moscow's war in Ukraine is for the center of the empire and its periphery. Now, this story is one of minorities being oppressed, something right up the Kremlin's alley. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Across Russia's vast landscape, the state coffers are bleeding red. From the Arctic coast of Arkhangelsk to the southern plains of Kalmykia, regional treasuries are nearly empty. Many governors now have enough cash to run their administrations for just a few days, a fiscal cliff masked by Moscow's triumphant rhetoric about stability and growth. The Arkhangelsk region, home to about 1 million people, had only $620,000 left, as 0.03% of its annual budget. Behind the numbers lies a silent crisis of dependence. Moscow collects, Moscow redistributes, and provinces tighten their belts. Some regions have already started deep cuts. In Irkutsk, education and healthcare budgets were slashed by over $60 million. Teachers in 12 regions have seen pay cuts, and small business owners face looming tax hikes from Yaroslavl to Dagestan. Even vehicle taxes are rising, an easy way to squeeze what's left of the middle class. For now, the Kremlin keeps funding the war and the narrative of resilience, but in the provinces, the money is gone, and with it, the illusion that Moscow can subsidize everything forever.
And now, let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. Russia is the world's largest country, stretching across 11 time zones and 2 continents. Now, to manage this vastness, it's divided into regions that reveal the country's political order, cultural mix, and immense natural contrast. Here's how this patchwork of territories came to be.
Russia today consists of 95 federal subjects, grouped into 7 federal districts, created by presidential decree in the year 2000, the central, southern, northwestern, Volga, Ural, Siberian, and Far Eastern regions. Each has its own administrative center and combines territories, republics, and autonomous areas. These divisions allow Moscow to monitor local governance, compare economic indicators, and coordinate policies across a landmass covering 17 million square kilometers. The largest of all is the Tyumen region in western Siberia, nearly 1/10 of Russia's territory, rich in oil, gas, and sparsely populated tundra. Beyond administration lies geography. Central Russia forms the historic core, with Moscow and the Golden Ring cities. Northwestern Russia blends imperial heritage with Arctic ports. Southern Russia borders the Black and Caspian Seas and mixes Orthodox, Muslim, and Buddhist cultures. The North Caucasus adds rugged peaks and dozens of ethnic groups. Further east, the Volga region is the industrial heartland. The Urals divide Europe from Asia. Siberia holds Lake Baikal and the Taiga, and the Far East reaches to the Pacific and the volcanic Kamchatka Peninsula. Together, these districts show the scale and diversity of modern Russia, a federation built for unity, yet defined by distance.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. For over 3.5 years, residents of Moscow, Russia's biggest cities, have lived through this war almost as if they were spectators of someone else's tragedy. Out of the regions, however, the war is not a televised abstraction. It is a missing breadwinner, an empty desk in a classroom, or the sound of a convoy returning to a half-abandoned town with fewer men than it left with. The Kremlin built its war machine on the backs of people far from Moscow, and the regions are now paying a price so high that even local media, carefully controlled but still closer to lived reality, cannot hide it anymore. The disproportionate sacrifice is not a bug, it's a feature. Putin's recruitment strategy was deliberately built to shield the capital from visible costs. The non-Russian republics of the North Caucasus, Siberia, and the Far East, along with poor ethnic Russian regions like Irkutsk and Tomsk, were largely targeted first and more intensely. Now, the logic was simple. Men who died far from Moscow did not destabilize Moscow. But while the Kremlin can manage headlines, it cannot manage funerals. And funerals do not stay local forever. Now, recent reports from 3 independent outlets give us a rare, unfiltered look at the scale of the losses. In Irkutsk and Buryatia, roughly 1/3 of more than 9,000 men drafted early in the war are now either dead or permanently disabled. In Tomsk, 1 in 4 men who joined has been killed, wounded, or is missing, and those figures cover only the first round of recruitment. In Sedanka, a settlement on the Kamchatka Peninsula, half of the drafted men sign up to fight, many will never return. These figures do not appear on state television. They appear in small regional publications, often the only ones left with enough access and public trust to tell a story. But their reporting is boxed in by Putin's revised Soviet-era doctrine of criticize but do not generalize. Now, this means you can cover the tragedy of Sedanka, but not question why dozens of those stories even exist. You can talk about one grieving widow, but not why so many widows live in the parts of Russia's furthest from the Kremlin. It lets the Kremlin feign transparency by allowing news of casualties, as long as no one connects them to policy. It makes the suffering look accidental, not structural. Even the returning soldiers are disillusioned. In Sedanka, the men who came home say the government erects expensive memorials but refuse to fix plumbing, housing, or heating in their decaying settlements. The message could not be clearer. Your body matters at the front, but your life doesn't matter here. This isn't patriotism, it's just extraction, a transaction in which the Kremlin trade rural lives for imperial fantasies. The Kremlin counts on the political reality that it has carefully engineered. Regional Russia is voiceless. Moscow controls the national conversation, the national narrative, and the national media. The only space left for grief is local, and local grief can't be ignored in the capital. The strategy works until it doesn't, because eventually, when there's no generation left to bury the next one, even silence collapses under scarcity. For now, Russians in big cities can still pretend the war is something happening on a map, but in the regions, it is happening in a cemetery. And cemeteries are not just local issues, they're national wounds, and when enough of them open, even propaganda cannot seal them shut. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow from Jamestown Foundation. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're trying to explore Russia's economy at this point of the war, which does seem to be in some trouble right now, but not just Moscow. Recent reports are showing that some of the smaller villages or even the satellite towns are even facing more trouble than originally assumed. Can you help us understand first how drastic is the issue there?
Well, the first thing you have to understand is that the Russian economy has 2 big parts, the military part and everything else. The military part, into which the Kremlin has been pumping money to support its war in Ukraine, has been doing relatively well, although less and less well as the war has gone on. The other part of the economy, what might be called the civilian economy, hasn't been doing very well and has gotten significantly worse since the start of the expanded Russian war in Ukraine. As a result, many people are suffering. Factories are not paying workers. We're seeing money owed to workers, back pay owed mounting each month. We're seeing ever more unemployment, although it's hidden, largely hidden. And we're seeing more and more factories shift from 5-day-a-week to 4-day-a-week production because there isn't the demand. The Russian sales of what it does produce abroad have declined. The Russian economy is therefore heading to what, at best, what people are calling 10 years of stagnation, at worst, a real recession in which ever more people not only in the rural areas, but increasingly in the big cities as well, are suffering. People who make a judgment about the Russian economy looking only at Moscow, however, are missing the point, because the Kremlin works very, very hard to ensure that economic hardships don't come into the population of the capital, lest that have political consequences.
Right. Of course, we also know that Russia has a very strong stranglehold on the media as well, especially within the Kremlin sphere. How much of this disparity is from the fact that perhaps issues within Moscow is also underreported compared to other parts of Russia?
Well, we know much less about what's going on in Russia than we've known since before Gorbachev. The media is tightly controlled, and foreign media has fewer sources to draw on to report what's going on. Nonetheless, you can't hide everything, and despite Mr. Putin's efforts to hide the economic decline, it's become obvious. Moscow, the Kremlin, it does try to play up any success story and to play down all the failures, but you can't completely hide that, because the failures lead to people being unemployed, to not having money for housing, not having money for food. We've seen the poverty rates, according to the best sociologists in Russia, are going up. The number of people who are having trouble paying for their apartments, paying for their food each month is going up. Those are measures that, while the officials don't play them up in the media, nonetheless continue to be discussed in the academic community. And so we can be pretty sure that the Russian economy is in trouble and will be in more trouble as long as this war goes on, and even after that time, because as any number of experts in Russia have pointed out, it's going to be very, very difficult for Moscow to change from being a war-driven economy to being a civilian one again. That's never easy for a country. It's been very difficult elsewhere, and it will be difficult for Russia. So it's not as if Putin declared the war over tomorrow, that suddenly the Russian economy would take off. The problems that Mr. Putin has created by creating a war economy are going to be with us for a very long time, even if Russian aggression abroad should slow or even stop.
Right, so I would like to go to the wartime economy and its transformation to civilian economy as well. But before we unpack that, can you help us understand how's the war been impacting some of the poorest regions of Russia?
Well, the war, the first impact of the war on Russia's poorest regions is that's precisely where Moscow has been able to draw its troops. Bonuses paid to people who sign up to fight are very high, even though some of them are now being cut. And what's happening is that many of the poor people in the poorest area, many men in the poorest areas, are going off to fight. That's having an impact on social structure. It's having an impact on birth rates. If you take men out of the population, you're not going to have as many children, and we've seen that. So the poorest regions are getting much poorer and much poorer faster than anyone else. The places that have done relatively better, the oil and gas producing regions, some of the other mining areas, not coal, but in the rare earths, you do see spots of relative success, but overall you're seeing this problem that exists, that was created first and foremost in the poorest areas, spreading to wealthier ones, and you're now getting reports of economic hardship in St. Petersburg, Kazan, and even in Moscow.
Right, so going back to what you mentioned about how difficult it is going to be for Russia to transform from a wartime economy back to a civilian one, do you think that that is one of the reasons why Putin doesn't have any real incentive to see the end of this war? Of course, there's a whole array of reasons, but do you think the economic factor of it is one of those?
Well, certainly it's one of the factors. I think Mr. Putin is committed to an aggressive foreign policy because the only way he can keep his team together, keep support, justify repression, is by continuing to fight abroad. He sees himself in a world where he thinks he's winning, where other leaders are deferring to him. And so I don't think he has much reason to stop fighting just now. On the other hand, many Russians who are suffering wish the war were over. Putin knows, and he's certainly been told by his experts, that once he stops fighting, there will be a pent-up demand released for more civilian goods, better housing, better food, more medicine, better schools. And those are all things that Russia very much needs. But if he puts his money there, he will have to take it away from the people who have been his primary supporters in the past. And that will lead to a political crisis in the leadership and could even lead to his overthrow. So he has all kinds of reasons that he isn't going to be for peace ever. But that the economic one is something that should not be ignored, because once pent up, you can say to Russians, you have to sacrifice. We're fighting a war. That's an argument that works very well in a lot of countries, and it certainly works most of the time in Russia. But once the war ebbs, once it's not at the center of popular attention, then people will say, well, why aren't our schools better? Why can't I buy the goods I want? Why is gasoline so expensive or not even present that I can't even buy gasoline? I can't drive my car. In those situations, there are going to be demands for changes that, if they are made, will undermine Putin's current construction of power. And if they are not made, will undoubtedly lead some within the Russian political elite to think that Putin has to be pushed out.
All right, last but not least, there's also a ticking time bomb that we're observing, that being the demographic issue. Especially within rural areas, it seems like they are literally running out of men, and also kind of disproportionately targeting some of the ethnic minorities as well. How big is that going to be an impact going forward?
Well, the Russian fertility rates, the number of children per woman per lifetime, have been plummeting. They went down in the 1990s. They rose a little bit in the first decade of this century. They have been falling ever since. Overall, the Russian rate is about 1.4, which means that the population will have, in 30 to 50 years, the fertility rate in the city of Moscow, according to official figures, is 1.06, which is less than half of the 2.2 that's needed for replacement. In non-Russian areas, the rates have also fallen, but they haven't fallen nearly as far. So one of the consequences of Russia's demographic decline is that Russia is becoming less Russian, less ethnic Russian, precisely the opposite of what Putin wants and what he's insisting that his officials say is the case. My guess is that by 2050, the percentage of ethnic Russians in the population will decline from probably roughly 72 to 75% now down to 60 to 62%. That decline will make it less and less sustainable to promote Putin's Russia for Russians policy, and will undoubtedly encourage non-Russians to think about leaving. Are the non-Russians suffering under Putin? You bet. Are they suffering demographically? Yes. But quite amazingly, quite not surprisingly rather, because they had much higher fertility rates than the ethnic Russians did, the decline in fertility among non-Russians, while significant, still leaves them with growth rates that are larger, or their declines are less than the declines among Russians. And if you have two groups, one of which is declining faster than the other, the one that's declining faster is going to be the one that's going to see its share of the population fall. And that's what's happening to the ethnic Russian. That's not widely appreciated in Moscow. It's certainly not something that the Russian media connected to the Kremlin is talking about. But it's one of the reasons to think that the non-Russian portions of what is now the Russian Federation are going to become increasingly active demanding that their increased percentage of the total population be recognized and that they get the support that they haven't been getting since Putin went to war.
All right, so it does seem like there are various of different pressure involved that needs to be released before anything could be done. In the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Moscow-backed authorities in Crimea are loosening gasoline rationing after weeks of shortages linked to Ukrainian drone strikes and refinery disruptions across Russia.
Starting this week, Crimeans will be allowed to buy up to 30 liters of gasoline per day, up from the 20-liter cap imposed in early October. The move comes as local officials claim the number of functioning gas stations has nearly doubled in recent weeks, from around 70 to over 130. The rationing was first introduced in late August, amid a deepening fuel crisis triggered by repeated Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian oil infrastructure. Temporary price caps of gasoline and diesel remain in place across Crimea. While Moscow insists the fuel supply is stabilizing, analysts warn that high demand and logistical bottlenecks continue to plague the system. The Kremlin says it hopes to fully meet Crimea's fuel needs by the end of October, but signs of strain remain visible across southern Russia.
The European Union is moving to tighten inspections of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, aging oil tankers used to dodge sanctions and fund the war in Ukraine.
EU foreign ministers are weighing new powers that would let Brussels sign inspection agreements with countries where Russian-linked tankers are registered. The aim is to increase checks on the estimated 600 to 1,400 ships used by Moscow to bypass sanctions and keep its crude oil exports flowing. France recently detained one such vessel, sparking renewed calls for tougher enforcement. Countries like Estonia and Latvia say Mediterranean EU members are not screening tankers adequately as they pass. Yet some officials worry stronger enforcement could trigger retaliation against European ships worldwide. The EU is already coordinating with Panama, whose shipping registry has agreed to delist vessels under European sanctions, a move Brussels hopes others will follow.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.